Indeed, this entire debate is built on the premise of free speech, on the understanding that free speech is the starting point and that what remains is to debate its limits. But I reject this premise. Free speech is a liberal position. It is an ideological liberal position, not some neutral universal. So here's a frank memo to the liberals. Enough of the self-indulgence. You don't represent the default position. Billions of people around the world are not liberals. Stop feigning universality. Don't drop the pretense and let's have an honest discussion. It is of the most basic human civility to respect others. That is the starting point, not free speech. To insult others is to treat them with gross insensitivity, insolence, or contemptuous rudeness. Those who want to allow this, the onus is on them, surely, to prove that such depravity should be allowed.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahi and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Sheikh Amr Saeed and Sim. The gentleman you just heard is Uthman Badar, who is a writer, activist, student of economics, Arabic, and Islam. He's a spokesman of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Australia, and he has been kind enough to join us today on the podcast. So, Usman, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks.
Walaikum salam. Pleasure to be here.
Well, that talk was a 10-minute clip that, you know, as we had spoken offline, Sheikh Amr has used that for his teaching purposes. But we're talking about free speech and whatnot. And I want to have Amr take run a little bit about how he kind of feedback you got. What's the perspective you're getting as you're trying to use that clip to teach Muslims in high school about free speech? And, you know, it certainly is an eye-opening, discussion.
Yeah. The misconception we have here is that every principle behind even sometimes of why we're Muslim and how to represent our Islam, we're utilizing free speech, and that's where everything starts from. Free speech should be the criterion for everything. Free speech is the best way to express ourselves, which is freedom of expression, and which leads to freedom of expression. But that's not where it begins. That's why I love this. I love this clip very much, and the students started to understand that very well too. That actually, it's very self-indulgent to preach free speech when a majority of the world doesn't really have the same concept of free speech that we have. That's why I love that he's enough of your self-indulgence. It's actually very self-indulgent to believe that you believe in free speech and everyone should believe it the same way, when absolutely there is no free speech, right? You can't, like he mentioned in that talk, you can't mention the N-word. You can't, and one example I gave to my students is, because some of them were debating me, and I said, is there really free speech on an absolute level? So does that mean that we can commemorate 9/11 and have a celebration? Everyone's going to be okay with it? Does that mean that someone, even though we don't acknowledge ISIS, can somebody go in front of the White House and wave a ISIS flag and say freedom of speech and expression? It doesn't exist, right? And obviously his talk has many examples. But it was just to set the tone about free speech, and a majority of the world doesn't believe in free speech like we believe in it, right? Like Americans claim to believe in it. So that's what we got out of that clip. It's a very small point, but if you can understand that properly, it unravels and untangles a lot of the misconceptions that, how to have a discourse with people,
Yeah, especially in the United States now, even we mentioned extreme examples, kind of like, okay, having a celebration for 9/11, right? Yeah. Or ISIS flag at the White House, but something which is something much more divisive, even a lot of Americans aren't united on, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Uthman, but Americans, especially since 9/11, like super patriotic, the national anthem, the flag, and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So obviously, and especially it's white America that is offended when you have like a lot of black players in the National Football League taking a knee. Even some white players now taking a knee in solidarity for the anthem because of what they believe the flag represents and what the country represents. And then the response from the privileged white masses is, well, if you don't like it, just leave. And for the black players, they're like, well, you know, what the heck? Like, you guys, your ancestors brought us over here on slave ships 400 years ago. We didn't ask to come here.
And we built the country, by the way.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So there's this like issue. They can't grasp this concept, or they don't want to, that just because you're critical of a policy within the country doesn't mean you like all of a sudden like have to leave. Like, why would you have to leave? You're not being a disservice in any way to the nation, right? So I don't know what your experiences are in Australia, how the concept of patriotism and whatnot, because obviously I'm sure you probably just couldn't. I'm assuming you probably just couldn't burn an Australian flag like all the time and say it's free speech, right?
Yeah. I think it's a very similar experience here in Australia. And I think that goes back to the fact that across the Western world, from probably the 70s and 80s, we've seen this movement towards what's called neoconservative, neoliberal types of cultural paradigms, understandings, and they've all moved towards the right in this sense of being very nationalistic. So in Australia, they don't talk in terms of patriotism. That's a very, I think, American vernacular. But in Australia, it's more about Australian values, you know, Australian identity, etc. And that's been used quite a bit, particularly since 9/11. But even before that, by and large, our conservative side of politics, which would equate to your Republicans, who've been in power, for your information, from about the late 90s to 2007, 2008. And we've got quite a lot of that, where it's, you know, everyone's got to subscribe to Australian values. Everyone's got to be part of this. This is our common identity. These are our common values. And like, they didn't ask anyone whether they're common. They're telling, you know, Muslims in particular, because that was the context, but everyone, that these are our values. But I think the point, going back to the clip, I think Sheikh Amir summarized it well, that not just with free speech, I'd go beyond that and say liberalism more generally, and a few of its fundamental tenets, whether it be free speech or freedom of belief or freedom of association, whatever, these various freedoms. The point is that these are ideological starting points that come from a particular worldview, and the way it operates is to make itself invisible, and therefore to give itself its universal neutrality, and then everyone else is meant to sort of respond to it or explain why they're a bit different. You know, the Muslims have got to explain your this particular hukum or that particular hukum which goes against it. And I think the point for us is we've got to step back and go, hang on a minute, this is not universal, this is not neutral. In other words, we have to show its normativity or its ideological nature, and then have a discussion between different ideological positions, different normative positions, as opposed to giving someone the superior ground by just assuming somehow they're natural, they've got a very natural position, and you know, we've got to prove ourselves otherwise. And that's the key point, which I think is very, very important for particularly Muslim communities to understand in the West.
Well, I think a lot of the questions that are posed to Muslims these days is from a liberal position, and that position is presented as the default position, right? That, you know, the whole framework of the discussion is from on their what's probably called from their court, right? Their basketball court, or, you know, you're playing within their rules of discussion. That's and right. How and the whole mode of question and answer goes along their lines, and you're really just setting yourself up for failure in that kind of a debate, isn't it?
That's right.
And not only that,
you put you on the defensive.
Of course, it puts you on defensive, but it makes you only work with the framework of liberalism. So you try to teach Islam through the liberal lens, and because the court, as you said, has been set, the criteria is set, and you can't go outside of the box of liberalism. So now people have to teach Islam within that box of liberalism, which ends up being a very bad situation.
So, yes, I was just going to say that's why I agree with that. That's why we get these type of rationalizations, you know, that hijab is about my freedom of expression, or any other particular hukum. And the fact of the matter is that obviously with the military, political, economic invasion of the Muslim world by the West has also come a cultural invasion that attacked Islam on numerous levels, whether it be jihad or the hudud or, various aspects of it. Anything that doesn't fit in the framework has been something you can attack. But if you try to rationalize it, or try to bend it by rationalizing it along the same sort of premises, you're setting up yourself for failure.
Yeah. And I think, how are you teaching Muslims in Australia? I know you're a pretty public figure. When we Google, anyone in Australia, we have a pretty growing fan base over there, our program at least. And we tried to find out anyone who's notable in Australia. Your name kept on popping up. So, hence we want to reach out to you and see what you're actually doing to educate Muslims over there in terms of how they approach a lot of these media formats and a lot of the discussions, because it seems like you need to have some kind of background in liberalism and understanding how to deal with a lot of these questions. So in your experiences, how do we teach that to our communities?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's almost a common sense type of position to sort of, and what you need to understand the position of your interlocutor, the people, the systems, the ideologies that you're speaking to, before you're in a good position to engage them. And you can't really debate that. It's almost obvious. But for a number of reasons, that's not how it's happened. Muslim communities came to the West, and to be fair, they came to the West in rather difficult circumstances, usually forced, war, economic strife, coming, an older generation coming to find a better life, so to speak. And then children, the next generation growing up also in various difficult social and cultural circumstances. So that should be kept in mind. But the point is that we need to understand who we're dealing with, basically. And that's not difficult, because that's what is taught around, in schools and universities. Although in places at lower levels of education, it can be taught as neutral, as universal, right? But at least in university, or at least, there's various literature that people can access where you understand liberalism, conservatism, progressivism, whether it be right or whether it be left, whether it be socialism, Marxism, various ideologies. We need to learn them as a community, be familiar with them, so that when we're out engaging, whether it be individuals or whether it be topical issues in society, we know what we're speaking to. We know the background. We know why a particular point is being argued, from which, for what reasons, from which particular perspective it's being argued. And so, to answer your question more directly, obviously our effort is education, more of a political / educational one. I believe that education by itself can only get someone so far. You need to have some sort of political program, by which I mean activists, right? You seek some level of change, some level of people to get up and move, not just to learn. So, for example, schools are a good example of just education, where you come out with some information, but you can do whatever you want with it. It's not really connected to any direct attempt to change or to begin to change the state of affairs. So, but within that, a big part of our work, both in the Muslim world and in the West, and for us here in Australia, is to try and cultivate a community opinion, a public opinion within the Muslim community that adopts an activist approach that is, number one, based on Islam, and that's probably for us the most important point. But number two, is aware, it knows what it's dealing with, and number three, takes a offensive, not a defensive approach. Offensive, obviously, not in the meaning of offending people, but offensive in the sense of taking the front foot, going on the front foot, seeking to score goals, if you will, not merely to defend. And that's easier. It's easier said, than done. But it's an ongoing challenge, and we've seen good results in the community conversation moving in the right direction. I can say, at least, due in part to
you mentioned something
multiple
about
efforts, not just ours, but there's been positive change anyway.
You mentioned about being offensive, right, or being on the offense per se, and we see that in a majority of your interviews, you're not falling into the game of the interviewer. And one of the main examples I'll give you, for instance, out of many of them, is when they tell you to condemn an act of violence that happens. You're not answering their question. You're not telling them. You're not responding to them telling you to condemn act of shooting or whatever. You're talking about a broader picture. You're making them think a little deeper, right? You're actually switching gears. And in the first 5 seconds, it may seem like you may be avoiding the question to some people who may not have patience. But after 5 or 10 seconds, one realizes that you're making them talk about something else, or you're making them in the audience. And can you kind of elaborate on how that's done and why you do that?
Yeah, because as a Muslim listener, or who's watching that interview, they're kind of just looking at you and say, Uthman, just go ahead and say condemn it. Just condemn it. Just answer the interviewer.
Yeah.
Just answer the interviewer. Just tell them you condemn it and then move on with the interview. So how do you handle that?
So there's a number of things here. First of all, just to the background of why I'm taking that type of an approach. The point to understand, particularly in media, right? We have to be cognizant of the particular forum we're in. Speaking to some, Joe Blow on the street is different to a media setting. It's different to me speaking to a politician, etc. In the media, we have to understand that interviews are not some sort of neutral conversation that's going on over coffee. There's an agenda. By and large, most media outlets, most media people have an agenda. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's something evil. What I mean by that is they're not, it's not just, they don't want to just find out what you believe and give you the platform to air your views. They come to the table with a particular view and with a particular position that they're going to try and push, and they're going to try and box you within that, right? And you can see, particularly with Muslims, because of the climate since 9/11, you can see that in almost any interview that a Muslim spokesperson does across the West. And so you got to appreciate this is a battle of ideas. It's not a conversation over coffee where they want to know my views because they're really interested in finding out what I think. It's not that. So when I know that, to take an example of say, discussions around terrorism and violence, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to go in there. They're going to try and make Islam and Muslims the point of interrogation, right? ISIS has done this, or before then it was Al Qaeda or the Taliban. They've done this. What do you say about that? Do you condemn it? And once if you condemn it, it's going to move on to, why is there this violent streak in Islam? What's going on? What can we do to help? And the whole conversation will move along this point where Islam is the point of interrogation. And I can either go along that path, but I achieve nothing. And usually for a long time, still there are some people who do that, but I think it's changing across the West, and it has changed quite a bit, where what Muslims used to do before is go along the line and sort of, we condemn this. Of course, it's not part of Islam. Islam means peace. Islam is a moderate way of life. There's some people who have hijacked it, but we're really good people. And although technically none of that is wrong, but it just reaffirms the problematic narrative that is being pushed out by the politicians, by the media, across the West. And people have to understand this. This is not just a narrative. It's not just, when I say narrative, it's not just some view. This is the basis upon which, US, European foreign policy rests, domestic policy rests. So that narrative is not just a series of ideas in some vacuum that they're chucking out. No, it's on this basis that people get incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay, in Australia, in Europe, laws, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, they were all fought on this basis. That's the material consequence of this, right? So you do not want to reaffirm those narratives. It's a dangerous game that you play when you do that. Of course, Muslims do that with sincere intentions, but it's the approach that's a problem. What you want to do is take a step back, and the point actually is one that I find 99% of Muslims agree with, right? So if I speak to any Muslim on the side and go, brother, clearly, obviously Islam is against violence. Obviously, we don't agree with bombing civilians, etc., etc. But surely, if we're going to talk about violence, the most violent people, the most violent institutions in our time are Western states, right? And no one disagrees with that. So, okay, if that's the case, when we're having a discussion about violence, why should we start those individuals or small groups who are reacting, regardless of how bad what they're doing is? Why should we start there? Surely we're going to start with the big actors, the ones that are causing destruction and chaos all over the world, creating wars and invasions and so on. Surely we should start there. And we can talk about the reaction as well. Got no issues with that. Yeah. But surely that's where the focus should be. And Muslims all know that. But trying to project that in the public discourse is where the difficulty is. But that's what you got to try and do. So you just take a step back and, you try and put the light onto them, so to speak. And obviously the key is to try and do that in an intellectual way armed with facts and figures and so on and so forth. It's not easy because, as I said, they're not going to just allow you to do that. Therefore, some of the interviews become a bit conflictual. There was one that one of my colleagues, Wasim, did that was very, very openly antagonistic. But again, a lot of even non-Muslims saw the point with the way the journalist was carrying on. Yeah, I guess that's a broad approach. And we can talk about, I guess, other sort of details around that.
Yeah, because if the main concern is violence, if it is that you want to talk about violence, then we should start off with the, like you said, the major players basically in violence. Is it that we want to talk about, individuals that are using trillions and trillions of dollars for violence, or some offshoot people here and there? If you take care of the big problem, obviously, the small problems are naturally going to wither away, right?
That's right.
And that's, I think, that's the perfect.
I think most reasonable people won't disagree.
That is the most human way to deal with it, right? We want to deal with the priorities first, which is the bigger problem. And the other thing I remember, there's another clip that, our viewers that can watch that clip too, about honor killings. That was a perfect example. They were talking about honor killings, and you flipped the script on them. They wanted you to apologize. They wanted you to talk about Islam. What does Islam say about honor killings? You didn't even want to answer it because you were thinking about the bigger picture, and I think that's how we should do it too. They're saying, what does Islam talk about honor killings? What does it say about honor killings? And in the beginning, you refused to answer because you're saying, if it is, we're talking about honor killings and women dying, why don't we talk about the amount of women that die in domestic violence in the Western countries? Right? If it is that I could talk about the Islamic reason, but I'm not going to talk about the Islamic reason now because, you're not going to fall into that trap, right? And we want to avoid falling into that trap. I actually don't think it's very difficult. I think that people are kind of afraid to take that approach.
Yeah, it seems like there's some kind of underlying psychological, maybe it's some kind of inferiority complex that a lot of Muslims have in general. Maybe it's from colonial era mindset that they just, even though they know the background behind their question, they just feel like they need to answer it just because they're in the spotlight and
exactly,
they fall victim to these games.
And there's definitely a lot of stress in that situation too, right? If you feel like you are carrying all of the Islamic people on your back and you just want to answer to the best of your ability, but sometimes you don't answer, man. Sometimes you have to answer the question with another question, right? And you can't allow yourself to automatically give a textbook answer. You have to make people think in the same process at the same time, right?
Yeah, I know in America, like talking to like speakers and whatnot, that they'll refuse to go on unless, because a lot of times it'll be like a Fox News. You have a 3-minute clip. Like I saw there was a thing I saw with after I think Orlando, was it after the Orlando shootings? I don't know if you're familiar with that, Uthman, where there's a gay nightclub that was shot up like about a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Right. And the guy claimed he was, even though he himself was like a homosexual, claimed that he was a member of ISIS. And then Hassan Shibli, he works for CARE, which is an organization in America, in their Florida chapter. And he was on with, I don't know if you know Ben Shapiro. And he got that a whole dialogue about, condemning, right? And Hassan asked well, Ben, do you condemn this, and this? Like, yeah, I condemn that. Like stuff that maybe that Western powers were doing, right? But then it's like he got out of nowhere because he entered into that space of let's just who's going to condemn what, right? It's not really
that's right.
Offering any solutions. And I think the important thing is the media has their agenda, but the masses who consume the media are malleable. And I think that's where, because if you talk to the average person on the street who are the people watching the news, that's where you can you talk to them on a real basis, they'll be like, yeah, I think they'll I could talk to a white person at work and they'll say, yeah, I think our concept of nationalism is overly exaggerated and kind of whack, and I don't really agree with it, right? Because at the end of the day, if you want to prove them hypocritical, because they say, well, U.S. citizens' lives matter. They're like, so you're okay with 500,000 kids being killed in Iraq, right? Or Madeleine Albright saying it's collateral damage. And then you spit on them well, who's more inhumane? Because they want to pitch Islam as being this, we're savages. I'm like, yo, dude, you're killing 500,000 kids.
And not only that, it tells you where the values lie, right? Whose blood is more valuable? You're telling us that because of the needs that you have and the luxuries you want to attain, that innocent lives, you're willing to sacrifice innocent lives, which between obviously the lines, and it tells you, whose blood is actually valuable and who's not. So there's people who can make that decision now.
There's a quote from, I want to get your take on this. There's a quote from Malcolm X, one of my favorite Malcolm X. He was doing an interview once. I think he was still with the Nation of Islam at this point, but the interviewer asked him, it was a white gentleman on a news show, like, people say that, you preach anti-white rhetoric, or like you hate white people. Like, do you hate do you hate white people? And Malcolm X said, to ask that question is an illogical question. It's like asking a black man why he hates the white people. White person is asking the fox is like the fox asking the sheep, why do you hate me? Because the fox is in there raiding to kill these sheep, right? Like, but then he has the nerve to like ask, oh, why do you hate me? Even though I'm like slaughtering you and your kids, right? And I feel like some of the wisdoms of Malcolm X is like so true today. I wanted to get your take on that kind of like, because he shifted the dialogue, right? He's like, oh, like what the heck? Like this question in and of itself is flawed.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, Malcolm X is on another level. Rahmatullah alayhi, is a master at the particular type of approach that you want to adopt. But also, I think he's a good example of why it's not easy, because you put yourself in a particular position where you're going to be painted as extreme, as radical, as everything that's negative, right? And we've had that here. So although within the Muslim community over time you've got a decent, positive reputation, alhamdulillah, but amongst the broader community, you get dragged into the mud, right? And so this point about Muslims and their approach, again, at one level, to be fair, it's not easy. But at the same time, I think what we have to appreciate is it's not an easy task to do this, and it's not your sort of everyday type of thing where it's just about coming on and being a nice guy to try and show that Muslims are good. I think a lot of Muslims have fallen for that, what they call in the social sciences the politics of respectability, where you just want to show yourself to be respectable. Perhaps if you do that, those who are accusing you will come to accept that, and things will get along. But it actually reinforces the problem, because you're playing to their lines and to their premises. It's like they say, you're savage, you're not human, and you say, no, I am human. That's all you're doing, right? And so the media does it all the time. So, apparently the positive news stories, we know what the negative ones are in the media, but the positive ones apparently are the ones where, oh, this guy plays soccer, he's a soccer star, this guy plays, maybe in your case, American football, and he's a normal guy, he's got a family, he's got 2 kids, and on the weekend he goes and does this. He's a normal guy just like us, right? Apparently those are the positive stories. And again, many Muslims believe that they are positive stories, but they're not. They're not positive stories because they actually dehumanize you. And they're basically saying, to be human, you must be like us. And being like us is this, it means this. And again, the this is, has very liberal contours. So I think what people like Malcolm X did really well was to first of all take a step back, look at the big picture, look at the forest, not mistake the forest for the trees, and then draw out a line of how to sort of get out of there and push back. It's very difficult getting out, but you can push back instead of reinforcing. And I think what a lot of Muslims tend to do is just to reinforce. Again, the intentions are very sincere, but it's not as simple as that. There needs to be much more research, much more effort, much more understanding about what's going on for us to come up with the right approach in how we can move forward.
Right, because you're just trying to, if you like buy into that rhetoric, all you're doing is saying like allowing some people to come up to the level playing field.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, oh, okay. So for example, there's I don't know if you follow the English Premier League. There's a player for Liverpool, like Mohamed Salah. He's got 30 goals already.
Yeah.
The Liverpool fans actually just retweeted this. They actually have a chant now. These kuffar say like, "I'll be Muslim too," right? Like Esther chant, right? I mean, we just gotta con them into saying the Shahada, and we'd be good, you know. But that begs the question, like, you know, we are proud. We're proud for our, you know, someone who's like, you know, outline, you know, he's showing, like, you know, he's representing the deen well, but at the same time, I agree with you. That's a beautiful point that I think a lot of us miss, as that, you know, oh, you tell your, like, you know, Kafir friend somewhere, like, oh, you know, look, this guy, he's Muslim, and now that just raises him up to that level, the ground level. 'Cause otherwise, their perspective of you is like, oh, you're beneath them still, right?
Yeah. So the most you can do with that, I think also to shed on light on that is, the most you can do if you follow that discourse is just bring them to a normal human level again. That's actually what it's doing. Right?
Yeah.
And so that means that is that what we're reaching for, though?
No.
It shouldn't be, right? And I think that's a very awesome point, Maheen. I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Uthman, I want to get
so just to add a point, it's not just bring yourself to the law. It does more than that, because what happens is the narrative again, or part of the narrative is Islam itself is not a religion of extremism, but there's this small minority that's hijacked it. And so we've got extremists or radicals and moderates, right? So there's this bifurcation that applies. And what you do when you come and sort of accept all that and just go, well, we're normal, all you prove for them is you're in the moderate camp, right? Yeah. But the camp still stays. And Islam as a problem still stays, right? Yeah. And it's just that all you've done is you've reaffirmed all of that, all the framework, and you've said, I'm here, I'm in the moderate camp, you guys don't know worry about me. But in the bigger picture, Islam's still the problem. They're still going to go to Afghanistan or Iraq to get the radicals. And why shouldn't they? Because you didn't really deal with the root problems. Whereas if you did the opposite, you go, okay, hang on a minute, guys. I get it, violence is a problem, but hang on a minute. The US has like 800 military installations outside the United States. So, are we worried about that? Do you want to talk about that before we look at reactions to a lot of the adventurism of the United States around the world? And again, if you're armed with the right facts and figures, I think some roads that are important.
Right. So, like, Uthman, I want to get your take on. So, I think so. There's probably a two-pronged approach here, right? So, number one, you're trying to highlight to the masses the hypocrisy from like these like random anecdotes that they want to point out. Like, okay, this, you know, there was this murder in London. This guy was knifed to death. It was brutal, etc. But on top of that, you're trying to go on the off and then show them the value of Islam for them as an individual, right? Like, how do we? Because you're trying to do both at the same time, and that's the kind of like and when you're when you're dealing with media like you are, and it's very challenging. I want to get your take on that, but also give us some advice on how we can do that when we're interacting with our normal like non-Muslim colleagues, friends, etc. Because some of them they do have these, because they consume the same media and they have these concerns, but many of them after they get to know me, they're like, if everybody like I had one person tell me like not too long ago, if people knew what you knew like about Islam, like everybody would be Muslim, right? And it's like, they didn't like, I think Sims had a similar conversation too, right? But you're trying to do two things. You're trying to like, they're conflicted because they see Islam as this like violent or, they have a certain perception. And then you're trying to like break that down, which you have. On top of that, then you're trying to show them why Islam is a faith they actually want to embrace and follow.
That's right. But that's why it's complicated. It's not easy again. But at the same time, if you follow this more upfront, frank, it's also more frank and more honest, right? But this more offensive approach, you're able to do both those things in a much more efficient way. And I say that because you're only going to be able to put Islam forth in sort of I won't say positive alone, but in a light where they can actually appreciate what it is, when you can show that it's not only is it the cliche complete way of life, etc., but you have to be able to juxtapose that, right? In other words, if someone's going to looking at things from a liberal framework, we're never going to be able to justify Islam. Right? You may be able to show them that God exists or basic things like that, but they're going to have problem with half your ahkam, right? And so this approach, because it starts at the fundamentals, and that's another important point, right? Beyond the politics and the violence and who does most of the violence, it is about the fundamentals. This violence is linked to liberalism. It's not an accident. And again, we can go into the history of why that's the case. But anyway, the point is, you want to talk about what's happening, who's doing what, but you also want to link it to ideas of liberalism, neoliberalism, and various other Western ideologies. But only this type of an approach where you look at a discourse or a worldview as a whole, and you present Islam as a contrasting worldview as a whole, then present Islam in a way they can begin to appreciate, right? Otherwise, there's no way. For example, any hukum, whether it be praying 5 times a day or something that's much more controversial, like a particular had punishment, other than the had for apostasy or something, or the had for stealing. There's no way in the world you're going to be able to justify that in a liberal framework, right?
That's
it just
true.
makes no sense. Why don't you just jail people, right? And killing people because they believe that is out of this world.
Or cutting
But
the hand off a
start
thief.
from saying, look, these are, any of the hudud really, and many other ahkam. But this is the problem, right? Even jihad in terms of its civilizational or state-based, how Islam expanded in the early years. Any of that, you're going to be left either going, oh no, well that was in the past, or this is not like, you're going to rationalize everything, and that's the problem. But if you start with fundamentals and you go, hang on a minute, no one has neutral normative positions. Let's get out of this. Nothing's neutral here. People start with a particular framework. People start with a particular prism through which they look at life and from which they build their ethical and their moral values. You're coming from a liberal perspective. Let's talk about that. We can talk about the history. We can talk about what it did and how it came to be and its contradictions in theory and practice, etc. And we can talk about, say, socialism as a contrasting one. And then we can bring in Islam. And you have to do it that way so that Islam can be judged on its own terms, right? Otherwise, if you're going to judge it on someone else's terms, it's always going to come out on the wrong side, right? It's going to be subject to severe criticism. But when you do that, I think we can both expose the dominant liberal order. It's been extremely violent. It's extremely a cause for inequalities around the world, global poverty. It's basically created a third world in order to put forth its model of the first world as something economically and socially progressive, right? But it's not. You come at the expense of destroying all of Asia and all of Africa in the process, to put it in a very caricatured way. But also, ideologically, liberalism, secularism, capitalism do not stand on very strong theoretical foundations. And if you can show people that, again, it depends on who you're talking to. If you're speaking to someone at uni, someone who's done, various social sciences, you can speak at a deeper level. If you're speaking to the common person on the street, you've got to speak in a different way. But I find in my experience, if you do that, if you bring them down from their sort of cloud on which they adopt the natural, progressive, modern approach, which is reasonable and scientific, and you guys are the ones that are struggling to come up to where they are, you're not going to get anywhere.
I think
But if you can bring it down, put everyone on something of a level playing field, and then talk about things, you're a much better chance.
Can we actually can we walk through an example of one of these scenarios you mentioned? Because when someone Googles you, right, one of the things they'll see is this guy Uthman Badar, extremist who says ex-Muslims should be killed, right? You probably know that, right? It's like that's like one of your
even
top
the guy
hits.
that introduced you on that IQ2. Even the introduction, I was like, man, what a horrible introduction. He's like, he's like radical Muslim, part of a radical group or something. I was like, when you have an academic discourse, you don't even if you disagree with somebody, you don't label them something before.
You don't disparage them.
Yeah, you don't disparage them before the person even presents.
I thought it was like radical, like Ninja Turtles, like radical, dude.
But you don't do that.
Yeah.
So even as soon as I saw that intro,
to be fair, that's a very mild description.
it is a mild description, but it's very disingenuous and it's not fair because we're claiming to have a mature academic discourse. And no matter how much you disagree with somebody in an academic discourse, you don't introduce them with that type of language, right?
All right, so let's talk about the Hadoo punishment for apostasy. Like, can we walk through that example and show how maybe because I think what you're doing is you have to take the person from the liberal vantage point of how they view that to the Islamic worldview, and at least even if they're not Muslim, how do we like engage in that on that level?
Okay, that's a good one. So it's a common one as well. So what you do is, first of all, it doesn't matter which order you go in. It depends. That's going to depend on the time and the place, and how much time you have and who you're speaking to. But you want to do a number of things. One thing you want to do is you always find first of all, pinpoint what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that Islam is violent, it's repressive, it imposes itself.
Or let me make it even better.
And,
let me play devil's advocate and let me be the one interviewing you. How's that?
It might just take a bit of time then from our interview.
No, it'll be a part of the... So Brother Uthman Badar, Islam says that you have to, if somebody leaves the religion of Islam, is an apostate, they have to be killed, or you have to chop the head off. How do you explain that, sir? How is that a valid human view to look at somebody who leaves your religion? Tell me. Okay, so am I responding directly, or am I meant to...
Yes, you are.
Respond to me, sir. I am interviewing you. You're on Sky News right now.
Okay. All right. Well, Islam says a number of things, about hundreds of legislative rules based on a number of foundations. Are you going to assess all of them, or are you going to cherry pick one in order to make it look black for a particular purpose?
This is not cherry picking, sir. This is inhumane. Like, we're talking about inhumane things. You're telling me to chop off, if I become Muslim and I leave, you're going to chop my head off. I'm not cherry picking. I'm talking about reality, sir.
Well, if we're going to talk about apostasy, I'm happy to talk about it. But perhaps a better, more concerning violence that's carried out against apostasy is when politically satellite states such as Iraq, such as Syria, go against their Western masters, and they are dealt with invasions and war and mass killing as a result. That's political. That's the way the West deals with political apostasy.
Well, you're changing the subject, sir. You're changing the subject. I'm talking about Islam. You're talking about Iraq and other countries.
Of course I am, because I'm going to get to the point here that if you're concerned about violence, if you're concerned about imposition, if you're concerned about people not having freedom, then it is the extreme of disingenuousness to start with things like this, where right in front of you, you have the United States, your country, who is imposing itself on the entire world. So if we're not going to talk about that, I'm very frankly not.
So you're not willing to answer the question. You're not willing to answer my question. So you're just say it. You're not going to answer my question.
You're not willing to face facts and face reality as it is.
Okay, I see what you did there.
I'm happy to answer the question, but I'm saying I'm happy to answer the question. But the thing is, each ideology, each worldview starts on certain foundations from which many branches. So, for instance, the United States still has capital punishment, which many people disagree with. But if someone was to come and say, just because the United States has capital punishment, the entire civilization, everything it's produced is bad, I'll say, hang on a minute, surely you should start with some more fundamentals: freedom, liberalism, the values of the founding fathers, economic and political systems that they have. Start with that. Is that how you're going to judge the United States? Are you going to judge the United States based on one legal ruling?
So what if someone says, what if someone comes back to you and says, like, well, I actually am a pacifist. I don't actually believe in my country's capital punishment laws. I don't want any capital punishment. So, like... That's
fine. That's what I'm saying. There are many people like that, but that's not the point. The point is, do you think it would be a fair judgment to judge a country, a civilization, a worldview based on one legal ruling when it's got ideological foundations, it's got various ideas, it's got a political system, an economic system, a judicial system, all of that? Surely you can agree that a fairer judgment has to take at least a cross-section of fundamentals, of certain branches, for you even to be able to understand. Otherwise, you're plucking things out, and also you would not only plucking them out, but you're trying to judge them by a completely different framework. It's like me judging a liberal America by a Marxist framework and going, well, how dare you guys give priority to individuals over the society? How dare you guys have private property? Oh my God, you have private property. That's oppression, right? But I'm just being a Marxist there and imposing my view on you. But that's precisely what you do when you judge Islam from a new perspective, and I reject that.
You know, a lot of times when a lot of Muslims who would be faced with the questions that Sheikh Amr just posed to you, they would start talking about the capital punishment for treason in the United States, or for example, I think there were some capital punishments that were carried out for famous spies and things. I think.
I know, but the reason I wouldn't do that is because, well, there's two reasons. I know internally it is something of discussion amongst even some Muslim scholars, although it's only a modern discussion about whether the had punishment for apostasy is for the change in belief alone or whether it's also for an accompanying treason. I don't believe the latter opinion has any real veracity. That's why I wouldn't go down that line. But the other point, more relevant to our discussion, is that I don't want to try and justify something in Islam because you do it. You get it? Like, I don't want to go,
perfect.
You guys do this, therefore, you know what I mean? Why should I do that? Why should I make them the reference point?
That's the main point. Yes, sir.
It's the other way around. If I want to justify something in Islam, I'll do it on our own terms. And that would be, let's change the context here now from a media interview to, someone I met at university. The way I'd actually positively, without showing them the mirror or reflecting back on the West, justify apostasy is very simple. And this is what I do with every single hukum. Because that's how Muslims believe. We don't sit there rationalizing every single particular hukum. We believe it because Allah says so, right? But that type of a reasoning is seen to be dogmatic in the West, right?
Yeah.
Because God says so. So there's a whole area there that's got to be peeled back as well. If you have time for discussion with whoever you're speaking to. But I say something, I put it very simple. I say, look, forget apostasy. We can talk about hijab, apostasy. We can talk about jihad. We can talk about many, many things. You agree with me on one thing, that number one, and these are just assumptions for now, number one, that God exists, and number two, that God says X. That's it. I want you to take these as presuppositions for now. And I want to ask you the question, would you accept X? X could be anything. But if God exists, there's an if there, and if God says X, and we're sure that he says X, do you accept it? Right? And I've used this strategy many times. I've never crossed anyone who said, no, I wouldn't. Because it's nonsensical, because the concept of God is the all-knowing, all-perfect, all-powerful being, right? He's telling you X, so clearly. So then what I say to them is, if you accept it, then the point is not X. X could be anything. The point is, do you believe that God exists, and do you believe that God said whatever it is that we're debating? So let's take the discussion there. And that also allows me to move the discussion to an area where I believe da'wah should be. Da'wah is about fundamentals. It's about belief in Allah, His Messenger, the Quran. It's not about convincing someone about hijab or even about salah or anything like that. It starts with, you've got to believe in God. You could be praying and doing all sorts of stuff, but if you don't believe, if you don't have iman in Allah and His Messenger, then that's not Islam. It's something else. Right?
What if you come back?
Anyway,
what if someone says, "Well, I believe in God, but I don't believe that God would say that"? Like,
yeah, Muslims say that
fine.
all the
So
time.
that's the thing, right? So this is where each layer then has to be looked at separately. If it's a Christian, he already believes in God, although we can talk about Trinity and whatnot, but maybe we can leave that for now. If it's an atheist, I've got to talk more about that level. But if it's someone, to your question, if it's someone who believes in God but thinks either that God didn't say that or that God wouldn't say that, again, I'll look at it on its terms. So someone thinks God wouldn't say that, I would try and take the discussion towards whether you have to try and be objective. I mean, is your God someone who says whatever you think he should say? Or is God in the position that you try and find out as objectively as possible what he wants and you do it? Right? Again, so we can talk about that at purely logical or reason-based levels. And again, I think people will agree that if I'm after a God that just does whatever I think is right, then that's a pointless exercise. I'm my own God, so to speak. I've taken my own rationalities and my own desires as what needs to be worshipped effectively. But anyway, that's the point, right? So
that is the point. If somebody claims that, why would God say that? Then what's the point of believing in a God, right? That's the main point. If God's rulings were open strictly on your opinion, then why would there be a God in the first place? But I wanted to switch gears a little bit here, and we can come back to this. Is that there's many people that would like to be politically active. There's many people who would like to go on media and represent Islam. There's many people who want to represent Islam in their universities, and there's many people who want to represent Islam to people in their workplace. Now, they are going to be put in the hot seat because of current issues and current affairs, right? So if somebody would like to take that position, starting all the way from being on the news, Fox News, for instance, what path do you think they should take of consuming? What type of material should they be going through? What would be point A for them, do you think? What should they start with in their research in order to better themselves to get ready for that position?
I think there's two aspects that are important. One is the content, and the other is the style. Right? So people can know content, but executing a whole different ballgame. So I think for the style part, you need some sort of mentoring, right? And I think there are now, perhaps there weren't 10, 15 years ago, but there are more anyway now in the US, in the UK, or in Europe and in Australia, people who I would posit humbly adopt the right, more sort of looking at fundamentals, more sort of on the upfront approach. So I think there's still a lack of sort of mentoring programs, training programs, but in any case, if someone's interested, they can get out to people like that and learn that, because it's content is one thing. You have to know the ins and outs of how the media works. I know how to do that. So when I came into the business, if you will, the industry, alhamdulillah, I had a couple of people who I could go to whenever I needed questions, and they gave me like advice that I only came to appreciate years later. I remember one brother who had done the work before me. He said to me, Uthman, never let your guard down in the media. They will speak to you like your best friends. As soon as they go on air, it's a whole different ballgame. It's a battle.
Yeah, I heard that before,
right?
too.
Don't let your guard down. And I sort of took that, and when he was saying it to me, this was probably like 8-9 years ago. I was like, yeah, it's probably true, but not that much. Surely there's not everyone like that. But literally my experience was, and I fell for it. I actually fell for it. You learn by your mistakes, right? I fell for it in the sense that I was a bit too soft, and I was a bit too perhaps naive in certain early interviews. Anyway, the point is, I think for the style aspect, you need some sort of advice, some sort of mentoring, someone you can ask. Content-wise, I'm not sure I can say, look, this particular piece of content, it's more different areas.
Like,
so
are there books? Are there books
know,
that you should know about worldview? Are there books that teach you about, like even if it's a beginner's book, if you want to know about discussing economics, should they go through Freakonomics, for instance? But something in general, like anything about teaching you how the world really works.
I don't have particular books on top of my mind, but what I can say is the areas you want to look for. And again, there's different people who have expertise in these areas who would know more specifically books. Or I'm happy to go back and put something together that you can share. But there's particular areas. So you want to know the dominant ideology of your society. You want to know about liberalism. Mm-hmm. You want to know about the opposite, conservatism, or about various socialist or leftist ideas and views. You want to know a little about the history. You want to know. You need to know Islam well. Again, and I'm not sure you can read a couple of books here and there to do that. Let me say something else. I know we live in a sort of an age of democracy where not just politics, but everything is democratized, knowledge and, being spokespeople. And whilst I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved, but at the same time, we've got to be real and accept that any particular enterprise requires certain hard work, certain qualifications, certain
qualities. Not everyone's built for it, basically. Yeah.
That's right. Not just from a natural point of view, but I think anyone can do what needs to be done to get there. It's not like certain people were disqualified, but it takes time and effort. Like it's not reading one book or two books, or it's going to take time. So for instance, and this is not just in media, I think if you're going to be involved in media, you've got to be involved in the larger, activist struggle for Islam Muslims, right? And I think all Muslims should be part of that in theory, right?
Yeah.
But to do that, what do a person need? You need to have knowledge about Islam, so you've got to be gaining that. And again, I think there are various avenues in the West now, alhamdulillah, compared to maybe 15, 20 years ago. You've got to be learning your basics, your fundamentals, and moving upwards and onwards in terms of your Islamic knowledge. And at the same time, the secular, quote-unquote, knowledge, the worldly knowledge that I think is important, are along these lines. What's capitalism? What's liberalism? Neoliberalism, all these sort of those worldviews, those contours, those discourses that define the society in which we live.
Yes.
Right? And the people who you're going to be engaging with are going to be moving from those or speaking from those platforms. So you have to know about them.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of times, especially when you see Muslim academics being interviewed in the media, you see them being posed questions regarding how Saudi Arabia or Iran is handling or implementing their understanding of Sharia. You see these academics trying to, they're kind of lost in that discussion because they really don't know whether they should actually validate the like a country like Saudi Arabia and their understanding of the Sharia or not, you know. So how do you what's your recommendation on how you handle those type of questions when
I mean, you have to have a clear position, right? And again, we don't have to paper over the fact that intra-Muslim, within the Muslim community, there are debates on everything, right? And there are different positions. That's not a problem. I find as long as there's open discussion and debate and people are willing to discuss these things, it's not an issue. But you as a person, as an individual, as a group, whatever, you need to have certain clear positions. So our position is that every single regime in the Muslim world does not represent Islam. Straightforward. That does make it easier for us also in the media, where people will put up Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan as some sort of Islamic state that we have to somehow defend. It's very easy. We have a simple line. I say every single regime, without exception, does not represent Islam. It's a legacy of the colonial era, and that's why we're working to remove them, really, and to work for change. So obviously, I can say that our sort of political agenda is a bit more radical, perhaps, than most Muslims. But the point is, you have to have a clear position. You can't be deciding where you stand in the interview, right?
No, but I think
regardless
regardless of what your position is in terms of the regime's removal, I think most Muslims can come to the conclusion that these governments are not representing Islam and the Sharia. And I think that's not a radical position. And I think that's something that we all can agree with, that these governments are not implementing Islamic law correctly. And I don't understand why that is so difficult for a lot of Muslim academics to actually explain in their, whether it's their research papers or whatever, you know, they can't come to this understanding that, hey, you know, this is not an Islamic government. Why do you think it's so hard?
That goes back to usually depending on which academic. I don't want to generalize, but by and large, if this academic has learnt Islam from the Islamic studies, quote unquote, that happens in the Western universities, then that starts on a very different type of understanding. And in that understanding, a lot of these regimes are post-colonial. They gained independence. You know, they're being run by Muslims, and they are legitimate attempts at apparently implementing Islam. And so that's just it's a whole different way of looking at things, right? So, for example, it's common in the broader narrative in the West, both in the academy and in politics, to, for example, that, you know, Iran and Saudi Arabia are at each other's necks because one represents Sunni Islam and the other represents Shia Islam. That's very common over there, even though amongst Muslims, although you get certain Muslims who will buy into that, you know, certain Shia, certain of our Salafi brothers who put, I guess, inordinate, in my view, attention on these sectarian considerations. But most Muslims will understand, hang on a minute, who made Saudi Arabia, who made King, whoever it is these days, Salman, who made him representative of the Sunni Islam, right? And likewise, I would claim who made Ahmadiyya before, and now it's Khamenei or whoever it is, representative of Shia Islam. These are nationalist states. They're secular by and large, apart from certain symbolic, rhetoric and symbolic institutions. The nationalist states have got nothing to do with Islam. They use certain sectarian cause for their political agendas, right? I mean, Iran and Pakistan they're called the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. The word republic comes from the French Revolution, right? It's like a quintessentially Western modern concept. It's got nothing to do with Islam.
You know, right? and that actually resonates with a lot of Western or European people as well, because they know from their own experiences and their own history of Europe, they see how the kings and queens of Europe abused religion for their own purposes.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And I think it's such a perfectly logical path that a lot of academics can take, but they choose not to for whatever reason. Maybe they don't want to go down the road of maybe that they're playing into the narrative of Islamic movements and maybe being portrayed as somebody who is someone from the radical Islamic movements. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think it's just because in the academy some of these views are taken as given. It's a dominant position. It becomes very hard, assuming that particular academic X actually believes otherwise, which I'm not sure they do, right? Because that's where they learn everything from. But assuming they do, it becomes very hard to challenge that orthodoxy. As much as we like to think of the academy as a place of debate and genuine debate and discussion and changing your view and open-mindedness, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is there are orthodoxies in almost every science. And it's very, very difficult for a person to challenge the entire orthodoxy. So you just keep going on with what it is. The other point is I think a lot of academics are not, for them the point is not political activism. Very few academics are politically minded with any sort of agenda in that sense. Otherwise, the reason they publish papers is because you need to publish to build an academic career. Right, so there's multiple factors, I think, but primarily I think goes back to the fact that there's these certain orthodoxies that are a bit difficult to challenge for most people.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to get your take on. So as we engage, we have a global listenership, right? And we have audience in the Middle East, UK, Australia, South Africa. The perception is I want to get your take on this. There's a perception that American Muslims are soft and we're all about assimilating and selling our souls to be accepted by the masses. Right? There's this and then we've bought into this so we have this thing here. I don't know if it exists in other parts of the world, social justice warriors. So we align with groups that promote faggotry or homosexuality, etc. It could be they're rubbing our back, we rub their back, etc. And we get behind liberal views. And then on the other hand, some of us, as a counter to that, join conservative movements, but these are conservative from the kuffar's perspective, right?
Yeah.
So
right.
what's your what is from your vantage point? What is the opinion of Muslims in America from the Australian brethren?
Yeah, what do you think about when you hear about American Muslims?
No, to be honest, I thought that's a very colorful description, but in terms of its essence, it's probably not different to how many Muslims, even in Australia, see the Muslim community in America. Again, obviously not everyone's the same. Obviously there's a difference and there's people who are along various positions on a spectrum, right, like everywhere else. But by and large, I think it is, from the outside, again, from my vantage point, it does seem that compared to the UK or most European countries and Australia, there's far less, put it this way, of a more radical, and I mean radical in a positive sense there, politics from the Muslim community in the US. Perhaps that's because even, a number of reasons, I can't see the equivalent of, whether it be Hizb ut-Tahrir or whether it be other groups in Europe, I can't see an equivalent in the United States. I can't see, even the sort of big name scholars that we see in the US all seem to take very moderate positions. There's been a change, I recognize that. Again, this is from my vantage point, there's been a change perhaps in the last 5 years. Certain of these big scholars have made, I think, positive moves. But by and large, that's what we see from out here, guys. So I'm sorry. So if you guys are different, it's a minority, or we're not looking in the right spot.
Oh, I sold my soul. But these other two guys, I don't know. They're probably still in the
You
hawk.
got a good price.
They're probably still on the hawk. Like I said, brother, he ain't got no filter, man.
We all claim to be hardcore until the government comes knocking at our door, and then and I'm gonna send
it could be that as well. It's not
Sheikh
necessarily
Amr told me to do it.
Yeah. It's not necessarily a judgment of the community, right? I think again, from where I stand, it seems that the United States is also a much more tough regime to deal with compared to Australian government or the UK government.
Yeah, because they're spying on us 24/7.
Particularly what we hear. Well, they spy everywhere. They spy here as well. But particularly what we've heard.
Americans spy in Australia as well. That's true.
Yeah. Well, particularly what we heard about what happened after 9/11, right? With almost a McCarthyist type, spying everywhere and taking people away by night quietly. That sort of stuff. Perhaps that had a big influence on the Muslim psyche in the United States. I don't know. But for better or for worse, I do think if we would have a spectrum, I think, our brethren and our sisters, I must add that, in the United States are lagging a little bit behind from.
So one thing I've heard people compare to UK versus the United States, right?
Yeah.
In the United States, as far as, so you've got blocks of Muslims. You've got the immigrants who've come over in the 60s and 70s for economic gain or education.
Yeah.
Our parents all pretty much, Sim, myself, Sheikh Amr, my dad came over for graduate studies in the 80s, right? And then you've got those who convert to Islam in America, and then you got the former Nation of Islam, there's a large African American indigenous Muslim population here, right? Versus in the UK, I hear about but an advantage with the immigrants in America who kind of drive or control the Muslim narrative overall are more upper middle class, right? So they're in corporate America, pretty well off. Whereas I've heard in the United Kingdom, they've been there longer, but they're more in the ghettos, of a lower socioeconomic status. So they feel and maybe in America, because you've become part of the elite, right? And so you kind of are trying to protect that status in a way. The dunya's become too comfortable, to be frank.
And that's one portion of it too. I think some of it is that what even some brothers from the UK told me, some academics from the UK told me, is that when the people came to UK, not only was it closer, but people who came there, they weren't as educated as the people who were able to make it all the way to America as far as the first generation is concerned. And secondly, you have to understand America is so much more vast geographically than the UK. UK is a lot smaller. Everything's kind of bunched together. And within that, you have about 3.5 million Muslims out of 60 to 70 million people, right? As in the United States, you have a little over 300 million people with about 10 million Muslims, right? But it's scattered all over these 50 states, and some of the states don't have any Muslims, some of them have very few, right? And I think that the UK has the advantage of having everyone so close together.
Yeah.
So you know what everyone's actually thinking. Everyone has their own block, basically, and it does have its disadvantages too, as far as disunity is concerned. But at least they, the Muslims in the UK are much more outspoken, I think.
That's right. Although I think a lot of those, there's always going to be multiple demographic and historical reasons. Perhaps in some respects, Australia is closer to America in some respects. So the people that came here in the 60s and 70s were also of upper middle class. But then we've got a mix, because then what happened in the 80s was the biggest Muslim proportion, I think now, is the Lebanese, and they came as a consequence of the civil war, right? So and they went through a very difficult time when they were here, the first generation, and obviously the kids grew up. And so, for example, in the UK, you've got Pakistani gangs. in here, we had serious issues with some of the Lebanese youth, right? For similar reasons. I mean, the Vietnamese came out after the Vietnam War, and the similar issues. People tend to blame the people, but they don't recognize that they've come from very troubled times and very troubled families. Yeah. But in any case, it's a mix. So you got that aspect, you got the upper middle class aspect as well. But I think it's also the approach the government takes, how sort of in your face they are, particularly from the Howard era in Australia. I'm not sure whether you guys are familiar with Australian politicians, so we're not that important in the bigger scheme of things. But since the Howard era, it's been a very in your face against Muslims, right? But that has a repercussion. That means that Muslims tend to then coalesce around each other. And then, it's an easy argument to make that, these guys are targeting you because of Islam and Muslim. It's not just something else. The other thing I think perhaps is important is America's got this very different mythology, I would say, but its narrative, the way it identifies itself in terms of patriotism, in terms of freedom. It's about freedom. It's about everyone has an opportunity. It's about hard work. Everyone can move forward. It's less sort of based on groups and ethnic or other identifications. And at least, or let me put it this way, the ethnic and religious identifications are less problematized. So you got African Americans and Muslim Americans and Asian Americans. Like you can have that. It sort of goes together. And so I think the approach taken there has been, emphasize the Americanness, emphasize that identity, but allow people also to have the freedom and don't problematize how they dress and what they eat and, their religion per se. And when you do that, always sort of go, Islam is a religion of peace, yes, but there's some people who are doing this. But I think in the UK and Australia, it's been, if I put myself in the shoes of the politicians, those dirty shoes, they've made some wrong decisions, I think, from their side in being too parochial. So in Australia, it was basically for about a decade after 9/11, it was basically, we're Australia, Australian values, everyone who comes here has to adopt this, and they were speaking to Muslims, right? In fact, one of the, I'll just end with this, one of the federal politicians, Peter Costello, who was the treasurer at the time, he literally said, when you enter a mosque, you have to take your shoes off, right? And then he said, so those people who come here have to basically come and adopt Australian values or don't come. Right? In other words, you have to leave your baggage, everything that doesn't sit well with the Australian values, which are basically liberal sort of values. You have to integrate, or you haven't got a place here. And although they weren't able to kick people out who said, fine, we're Muslim first or whatever, but that was the rhetoric and that was the politics for a long time, and it continues even to now, although it's been adjusted to some degree.
So Uthman, before we wrap up here, I want to get there's a question that we've discussed amongst ourselves for a while, and these guys don't even know I'm going to ask you because I just thought about this, and I thought you might.
Get ready for it. Get ready.
Here it comes.
I just thought you might be able to give a good answer. So there's all this talk about like refugees and whatnot, like from Syria, and then, and obviously refugee bans in America, and they're saying, well, look what happened in Europe. There's this rape culture that is being imported. And I've had like people ask me like, what, you guys have this rape, because I'll tell people like Islam is a solution. This Me Too movement, like we have this thing called Me Too now going on in America where
you
know about it, right? Okay, so
yeah.
all this like sexual harassment and we're like, listen, we don't even do khalwa, right? Like what the heck? Like if y'all just follow like Sharia laws, none of this garbage would happen. And like, but you guys have rape culture, and I'm like, what do you? And then I'm like, and then you hear reading the news, I'm like something doesn't jive here. Like, what's going on? Now, I know, for example, like, I was born in Bangladesh, right? I don't know, when I go to Bangladesh, you know that like Bangladeshi like dudes like back in Bangladesh are like perverts. They'll like grab anybody, right? And I know that for a fact.
It happens in the subways of Chicago or New York as
right?
well.
It happens everywhere.
But people say that it'll happen at Hajj now, right?
Yeah.
So like, what's this rape culture? Is this fake news, or how do we understand that? What's going on here?
Oh, well, I'm not going to claim to have some sort of definitive theory on this.
I just threw it out there. I just thought you might be,
I will say, I mean, what tends to happen is you get the latest main item of news that everyone's talking about, and then there's always some dominant narrative around it. People are pushing. So, people have got to take a step back and look at things in some context. Obviously, Muslims are subject to the same human imperfection that everyone else is. And so at one point there is a problem where Muslims become too defensive, whether it be about imams or about anyone. They're all humans at the end of the day. And so we can't get defensive and go, no, we're all perfect. This can't happen at the Hajj because the Hajj is, the sacred holy land. Yeah, the land's sacred, but people that go there do all sorts of stuff. Yeah. And people know, for example, that stealing goes on around the Kaaba and in the Hajj for years.
Yeah. Right?
You probably had many experiences. So someone can steal, that means they don't really care that, or at least I don't want to say that, but they're sinning openly. So there are other types of sins that people will do. So we've got to stop being ultra defensive, number one. But at the same time, you don't have to buy these sort of gross, sort of generalized analogies just because there's a certain rape culture or a certain way in which women are treated in the West doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same in the Muslim world. There's going to be different dynamics. There's going to be different reasons, different issues. In what you're mentioning about Bangladesh, I haven't only heard, I've seen it myself in parts of Pakistan. Well, to be honest, it's a bit less. I go to Pakistan every couple, 2 or 3 years, and I recall from bygone years seeing it more explicitly anyway. But that probably don't know what that would mean in the bigger picture. But the point is that, it may also happen in some subways in the United States. But I wouldn't draw these general analogies and go, because it's here and because it's there must be for similar reasons. There could be very, very different reasons. So we really have to look at everything within its own particular context and try and assess why it's happening, what's the issues. And when we talk about Muslims broadly, obviously we are going to have issues. We are away from Islam, surprise, shock, horror. It's been years since, we've had anything that can be called an Islamic society. And the human being is not an abstract individual that just you plant him anywhere. Society has a big impact on him.
Of course, no matter what label of religion he puts on himself. I think when somebody says that, you have to understand, and you have to bring it back to a certain point. You have to utilize that opportunity and capitalize on that opportunity by saying and letting them understand that, listen, Muslims are going to be human beings until the end of time, because they're human beings. Just because they have the label of Muslim and Islam on them, it doesn't mean they follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for them to follow, right? And that gives us an opportunity to bring it back to Islam. If they're debating about Islam, I would say, listen, we could discuss all of that. Let's first talk about the creator, and if there is a creator, let's talk about if the creator sends messengers, and does that creator want us to understand something? Does he want something from us? Is there a purpose to all of this? If we solve all of that, then we'll talk about everything you want, the mistreatment of women, and women not getting as much inheritance as men, and the rape culture. We could talk about all that stuff. But if you're actually serious about a conversation to know where all this comes, let's talk about the original purpose of where all this stems from, right? And I think that's our opportunity to bring it back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bring it back to Islam, I think.
That's right. And I think that's what makes the discussion fruitful.
Yeah.
You have to keep in mind always, we should ask ourselves, what's the purpose of any discussion I'm having? And I always think about the Pakistani dawats, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, where the uncles will come and sit down.
No, we're actually not Pakistani, so we wouldn't understand.
Or Bangladeshi, right?
I'm just joking. These guys are hydro.
I'm sure in this case, I can generalize. The Arabs are the same. They're all like that. So over food, they all talk about politics, right? They talk about politics back home, right? This is happening, and this side, and Imran Khan, and Nawaz Sharif, and blah blah blah.
Yes.
But you're sitting there going, what's the point of this? Like they're gonna whinge about it.
Yeah.
No one's going to do anything. Everyone's thinking about work next morning.
Yeah.
And I don't say this. I know it's the older generation, and they've been through difficult times. But the point is, that discussion has almost no purpose except as an outlet of release. You just release.
Yeah.
And then you go back to your normal life. Then you come back to the next dawah a few weeks later at someone else's house, same group, having the same discussion again, right? Just venting. So we have to ask ourselves, even if I'm speaking to a non-Muslim about rape culture, for example, what's the purpose? Am I just going to go, yeah, we're like this, or we're like that, and this and that, or some big massive political analysis or social analysis that sounds good? What's the point? What's at stake here? And you're right, if I can direct that discussion to be more about Islam, to be more about some sort of in the dawah context, then I make it fruitful for myself and for the person.
Brother Uthman, you have been through a lot of debates with liberals like Lawrence Krause and all these other famous personalities. I wanted to know your thoughts on a lot of the discourse that's taking place in the West in terms of power dynamics, and I think the prism that the left has, or liberals in particular, have put in place for everything. I know Mahi just talked about the Me Too movement, but there seems to be a shift in a lot of the discussion. And in that everything is looked at through positions of power, whether you're tall or short or black or white or skinny or fat, all these different positions of the individual is looked at through different positions of power they have in society. Whether you're a boss and a secretary, what are your thoughts on how this is all playing out and unfolding before us?
Again, this is where knowing sort of where different ideas come from and locating them vis-a-vis each other is so important. A lot of the power-based analyses are courtesy of what's known as critical theory, and various other post-Marxist or neo-Marxist approaches. So it's basically, by and large, the left, and certain, but more so not just the left, but academics and people in the academy who've come up with various positions. Anyway, that's a big discussion that we can have at some other point. The point is, number one, knowing this, so you're not sort of taking something outside its context. But number two, for us, it's always going to be a question of, or an issue of, let's understand what's being said, and then let's try and see what Islam has to say about it, right? Particularly if it's some sort of normative position, some ethical or moral position, as opposed to some sort of description. If it's a description, and we can't always separate the two very cleanly, but at some level you can. If it's a description, we can see whether it's insightful, whether it makes more sense. So, for example, what are called sort of structural readings of race or racism, gender inequalities, etc., make a claim that what's more important is institutional discrimination or institutional oppression, not individual, right? That's not making a normative claim, although it presumes that it's wrong, but it's trying to make a point about if, for example, in critical race theory, if the racism that the state or institutions of power deploy in order to invade entire countries, colonialism was hand in glove. Racism was used hand in glove with colonialism. It was deployed as one of the means to say that all these other races in the 17th, 18th century are inferior, white man is superior, we're out there because it's a civilizing mission, right? That's racism, right? That's very structural. And so the point is, just as one example, that's far more important than some guy on the street who just doesn't like my skin color and, says some slur to me. That's a problem. That is a problem. Yes, that's also racist, but clearly there's a big difference between one and the other. So that's something descriptive. But the point is, understand where these things are coming from, see what Islam has to say about them. And I think this is where really a lot of work needs to be done. You're right, there is a shift towards these discussions. It's important to look at why it's happening. It's important to look at, what's being suggested. And I think when we do that, and to the extent that I've done that, there are some good insights that we can get from these academic analyses, but they come as a package by and large. They come as a package, and so unless you're able to take the good, so to speak, and put it within the Islamic framework, which you're very comfortable with, which you know and which you're carrying, then we can be in a problem. And I think what's happened in a lot of cases, again, seems to be more in America, is that some Muslims, young Muslims at university, have been taken with the wave, right? So they'll be parroting the language of feminism, they'll be parroting the language of racism, of other identity politics, because, again, they're sincere, right?
Right.
They're sincere, they care about minorities, they care about oppression, but what we need to realize is it's not just about me recognizing oppression, it's what I do about it. And Islam comes in part to do with oppression. So it'll be a big problem if I go, yep, there's this oppression here, let me join hands with some kafir, approach or framework, whatever it may be, right, left, center, whatever, to do something about it. That's a big problem. You've explicitly or implicitly left Islam to the side. And always Islam, in its comprehensiveness, is going to have something to say about that. It's going to have a certain approach that is different to what some leftist or some conservative or whoever is going to come up with.
Yeah. To summarize, you're saying, like, for example, things like homosexuality or the woman's right to choose on her body regarding abortion and things like that. These aren't. They have to be. You can't just jump on that train because they seem like
helping out the oppressed.
Yeah, like you're trying to jump out on the social justice framework because just for the you have to put it in the Islamic paradigm, and you have to
That's right.
evaluate.
That's right.
Each,
let me make that a bit more concrete. Let me make that a little bit more concrete. So I can sort of I can hear that blacks in America or other minorities in America, Latinos, etc., are being oppressed, and I can hear about Islamophobia, and then I can sort of go, well, look, or even homophobia. I can hear, look, Islamophobia, and the left helps us, and the left speaks for us, and therefore we should return favor and also stand with the those who are fighting homophobia or those who are fighting other types of racism, with feminists, etc., right? But the point is, to what end, right? Where's this going? Fine, I get it. There's oppression, and there is a lot of oppression, and the liberal order. Sorry, just a clarification that I've been wanting to make. When I say liberal, most of the time I'm speaking capital L liberal, which applies more to the right than the way they use it in America, where they refer to the progressives on the left as liberal. But in any case, in this case, we are talking about the left. We're talking about progressives on the left, Greens parties, other progressives who have adopted a lot of this. What's an identity politics, basically? It's about identity, right? And everyone can have their identity. There's no fixed identities, and there should be. You can't really judge anyone for what they are, etc., etc. But the point is, fine, there is oppression. The system does oppress. No doubt, capitalism is thoroughly oppressing, and that's what it's done since its inception, or just in different forms in different times. But what's the end here? How do you think a particular Marxist or a particular socialist or any other approach is going to alleviate that oppression, right? Vis-a-vis Islam. So if you speak to me, I'm going to say, look, what Islam does, it comes with its own framework. Islam doesn't look at people in terms of their identities. It doesn't define people based on their sexuality. It doesn't define people based on their race or their ethnicity. So it doesn't do what capitalism does, number one, but also not in reaction. It looks at people as human beings, slaves of Allah, all slaves of Allah, only to be judged in the end by Allah on their taqwa, right? Number one. Number two, practically what Islam does is it brings an entire framework, economic, political, social, in the form of what we know as the caliphate or the khilafah, right? And so that's a big discussion in itself, how, when, why. But the point is, I can speak to you about an end game. We should be working towards something like that, right? In the Muslim world, first of all, anyway, there's details. But if I ask you, the Muslim who's jumped onto some leftist bandwagon, where are you going with this, right? The answer really, if they know their stuff, would be nowhere. Because it's all about, by and large, most of these critical theories are about critique, and
an agreed set of values, right?
Sorry?
Because in the end, they always say that it's about what we humans agree to as a set of values. They don't say like anything. There's no end game to anything, but what we all humans end up agreeing with. And
yes,
that's the moral
although the right
code.
will say that as well, right? That's just a secular premise. Most people on the Western political spectrum will say that. But what's different here is these guys will problematize power itself. So it's not just that, the racism when tied with power or gender inequalities when tied with power are far more oppressive. I would agree with that premise, but they problematize power itself. And so the point is, even if Muslims were in power, they would say that what you guys are doing is racist or sexist or misogynist or whatever the case may be. So if you ask them, well, what's the solution? Look, do you want to be in power? They can't be in power because power is problematic, right?
Yeah.
No one particular ideology or worldview can claim to be solely right either in their view, right? So in that sense, I'm saying there's no end game. You're not getting anywhere, and that means you're not going to really get anywhere about dealing with that oppression. And so are you really contributing to the alleviation of oppression, which is what you sincerely wanted to do and jumped on the bandwagon in order to do, right?
Right. So let me ask you. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's some scenarios where people would say there's actually repercussions for our involvement. Let's take another example of a conservative position, right? So we had, and this was discussed on another podcast that we recorded recently, where there was a case here where a Christian baker, like he makes cakes, and he refused to make a cake for a gay marriage, right? And a lot of Muslims, because Muslims in the mainstream are so in bed with the leftist movement, were silent on it, and only in small circles were we discussing like we should have been supporting of this baker because we share the same values, and if we allow this kind of LGBT discourse to become so mainstream, it's going to come back and backfire on us in many ways, right? Like for example, Sheikh Amr is involved in Islamic school, and if legislation and the narrative it's accelerating quickly. Like 20 years ago, it was very I could say faggot in school all day, and like everyone it'd be cool. But now it's like, God, those days are long gone. There's no safe spaces anymore, right? Not that like we should use that kind of vernacular, but I'm just giving an example. But like he could have like an Islamic school teacher, like somebody's like, oh, I'm gay now, and then they could get a lawsuit because it's so normative. So wouldn't you wouldn't it be pragmatic in some ways? And because there are some things that our values are in line with certain things that we can have an impact on while we're living here.
Yeah, look, I mean, I followed that particular case. It was obviously quite popular around the world. The thing is, I have a problem with both those sort of approaches. I think we need to come up with a more original way of dealing with the left-right divide. I have an issue when someone says we've got more in common with the right because family values, Christians, religion, blah, blah, blah. I think that's a gross miscalculation. Because the matter of the fact is, and that's not me saying we've got more in line with the right. The point is I'm saying let's get out of this spectrum. Let's stop boxing ourselves within. Because the point is you're always going to have some features of some common points with any other ideology in the world. Right?
Yep.
Maybe leaving aside devil worshippers if they exist anymore. But everyone else, you're going to have some common. Right? And you're going to have differences. So how do you sort of judge who you're closer to? It's not a science. It's just, and therefore I think there's no point of doing that. So if I look at the right and I go, okay, well, they apparently, it's about family values and they got certain Christian, and the Christians have their religious to some extent, but they hate the guts of Muslims. They're more militarist. They're all in favor of war. And then if I look on the left, I go, obviously homosexuality, and there's far more, social sort of freedom in a way that Muslims find, problematic. But at the same time, there are points of commonality where they're more collectivist, less individual. They're more worried about what happens with minorities, whereas the right's just going, and people like Ben Shapiro is just going, oh, it's not about outcomes, it's about opportunities. It's about opportunities if everyone's got equal opportunities, which is nonsense, right? And the thing is, it is minorities that know from practice that we don't have equal opportunities, regardless of what the Constitution says or what various people are parroting. So there will be commonalities on both sides. There will be differences. You're not going to be able to weigh them up and go do some sort of equation. We need to stop and go, okay, it's not about them, it's about us. What do we stand for? What do we stand for? What do we want here in America, in the Muslim world, whatever the case may be, and judge each particular position based on that. So instead of going, this baker, the guy who didn't bake the cake, instead of going from a leftist angle and going, well, we've got to support the left because they supported us, or instead of going, well, we need to stand with some aspects or some people on the right here because we could be next. It could be a Muslim baker next who refuses to bake this cake, right? And I think that's a very instrumental logic, which is problematic. Rather, we should go case by case, not because of the right, it's not because of the left. Yes, I think in this sort of a case, I would find it problematic that a person can't refuse someone because of their conscience. I think that's an issue Islamically, right? But I think it's very important for that position to be articulated within a broader articulation of your framework, your politics, your activism that is uniquely distinguished both from right and left, right? And that's my point. You can't be, you haven't really got a position, then you come out and say, in this case, I'm with these guys, and this particular issue, I'm with those guys, and in this particular issue.
Under the aegis of conservatism.
You're everywhere, right? Whether it be conservative, whether it be progressive, sometimes you're going to be here, sometimes for example, when the conservatives are beating the drums of war, obviously you're going to stand with the left, right?
Right.
You're going to say, we must stand with the left because Muslim blood is going to, but it shouldn't be because of the left.
Yeah.
It should be because Islam says X, Y, Z.
Because of the truth.
And so I think where we're behind across the West, not just in the United States, is in articulating and in practicing this more intrinsically Islamic type of activism.
But I think to be more specific, Brother Uthman, forget about even if there was a right or a left. Imagine none of those are even here, right? Right, left, conservative, liberal. And there's look at the example as it is, for what it is. The baker decided not to bake this cake, and he had this whole onslaught against him. Now, do you think Muslims should even get involved because they share the same value with him, to just support him, not because of right, not because of left? Again, just to reiterate, just because they agree with that value of gay, opposing gay marriage, for instance, or not agreeing with gay marriage. And they're like, hey, man, this guy, he's taking a hit. Why don't we all just support him because we agree with him himself and the action that he took?
Well, the thing is, I don't think in real terms we can have this sort of abstract, there's no left, there's no right, because it happens in a context.
I understand it happens in context. But let's just say there's a group of Muslims that don't even care about that. They just were like, man, this guy, he agrees with me exactly what I believe. Why don't I just join him to raise awareness that
about what?
That we don't agree with this either, and that we don't care what the mainstream is saying.
But this is the point again, from a practical point of view. If you are active and you're going to do activist stuff to make certain points, this being one of them,
yes,
that people should not be forced against their conscience, then it only makes sense for you to do that within a broader activism.
Of course,
it's not as if unless you're sort of just minding your own business, doing your sort of thing, and then you want to come and help the baker, right? Doesn't look like that, right? In practice, there's going to be a broader framework, and what I'm saying is that broader activism is going to have a particular tinge. It's going to have a particular position on the left and on the right, and so on and so forth. And that's where the money is, if you will. And I think we just got to be more original. We got to have more confidence in Islam. I think the problem is, and again, I don't blame people for this. There hasn't been enough of an articulation from our ulama class, if I can be critical of them. They've been far too secularized in terms of only dealing with individual-based things. And therefore, when it comes to politics, to a large extent, the Islamic or the Muslim position has been vacated.
So if
when young people come in, they're not. What are they going to use? What are they coming off? That's why they're jumping on various bandwagons here and bandwagons there. But our challenge is to not to take up our position, but to take it up in a way that's independent, original, grounded in Islam, well thought out, aware of what we're dealing with in terms of the knowledges, and we move from there.
So to go back to the baker, I'm sorry, I don't want to keep lingering on this, but so what you're saying is, if somebody was to help another person, a baker in this instance, and to agree with his opinion, and this person just innocent, they don't care about anything, they're not even involved in politics, but regardless, if they were to support him, unknowingly they're going to be a part of something even bigger, right?
Well, they could be.
They could be, yes, right.
Most likely they will be.
So,
which is why it's important that Muslims, if they're going to be part of this, they should do it under the umbrella of Islam. That Islam says.
That's right.
Exactly. Yes.
That's our point.
So any initiative, if you really think about it, the reason I'm asking that is because any initiative that you take now, or anything that you agree and you decide to go public with it, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's on Twitter, it should be under the umbrella of Islam, or else then you're just falling into something that you may not be able to get out of, right? And it's not Islam.
That's right. And just to be clear, under the umbrella of Islam doesn't mean you always have to mention the word Islam and you have to sort of explicitly make it like that. But the point is,
right,
you've sat down and thought through and you understand what your agenda is. You understand what your end game is. You understand what you want to achieve from generally from your activism, but more particularly from this particular action, what you want to achieve, right? So you have a particular argument, and it's only by knowledge of the people that you're interacting with, the left, the right, blah, blah, that you articulate it in a way that's right. So for example, if I agree with the break, and as I said, generally in this case, I think it's not right to force people to do it in that way. But if I would agree with you, if I come out and just say, I support the baker, poor guy, he's being oppressed, why does he have to do this? It's against his freedom of belief, blah, blah, blah. I'm just playing into a liberal narrative about freedom of belief.
Yeah.
And most people who are unaware, even Muslims, will do that because that's what everyone else is saying. That's what people on the right are saying. And if I'm coming in to support them, that's what I will say.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm aware, I'll be careful and I say, yep, I want to support the guy. I want to make more importantly, it's not about the guy. There's a much bigger politics being played here. I want to make a point, and I want to take further our community's Islamic activism. And part of that would be me not using the freedom of belief line or the freedom of conscience line, right? For example, that signals an awareness.
Yeah.
And I avoid myself reinforcing problematic positions.
Yeah.
Right. I think the challenge though is like if you look at what's our percentage in America? Like 1% of America is Muslim.
Yeah.
And then the overwhelming, like the establishment, right? Like the Muslim organizations are pretty much like a lot. They're playing the political game.
Yeah.
Right. So you're looking at basically like a small, like a tiny, a tiny fraction of that 1% who might. Like, because even the people who like would hear this talk and they'd be like, "Yeah, that makes sense, Uthman." But like practically speaking, like the only people that like 99% of the Ummah in America is bought in. I think the only cats that would probably be like so the establishment has their thing, and then you got but it's like the African American Muslims. Those guys are like they're not down with the establishment, like organizations, etc. But it's like there's just an uphill like climb. I think that's where people need to get that like that jump.
What do you mean there's an uphill climb?
Meaning that like so you have
practically it's very difficult.
Practically it's very difficult, right?
Yeah,
because number one, your leadership is not down with this. Like their leadership has bought into something. Has bought into playing the game.
Yeah,
right.
That's true. Look, what I'd say is, and that's a very valid point. You can have a very nice sort of theoretical discussion. It's an immensely uphill battle, but we've had a very similar thing in Australia. It's just on a much smaller scale. But this is what you got to do, right? Just be very, very clear and upfront. The so-called leaderships. First of all, you got to get over this idea that there's leaderships. Leadership in Islam is about intellectual leadership, right? Apart from the only legitimate Sharia leadership is the Khalifa, because he has a particular position based on the texts, right? And then everyone whom he appoints. But when we've come outside into these Western lands or other lands, there's all sorts of leaders, there are all sorts of claims. Where does their legitimacy come from? That's another topic. We don't have to go there. But the point is, one of the beauties of our deen is La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. The point is, you're not asked to change the world, change all of America, you and your mate. Now that you've heard Uthman Badar make things a bit clearer, Astaghfirullah. It's not you and your mate have to go out and change the world. It's not like that. It's just you do what you can. You start somewhere, right? And to share our experience in Australia, if we went back about 10, 15 years, 2005 actually. 2005 is a very important year for us. That's when John Howard came out. It was after the London bombings, which were more important actually for us than 9/11 was. Why? Because that was homegrown terror. That was like, oh my God, how can these guys who were brought up in the West, in the enlightened West, how can they come back and do whatever they did? So that was so important for us. And what the Prime Minister, he did very, very quickly, about a month after the attacks, called in all the Muslim leaders, quote unquote, called them into Canberra, the capital city, outside Parliament. They had some meeting, had a photo shoot, and basically all the Muslim leaders are standing there. Some sheikhs are wearing the turbans and blah, 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 and, 20 of them, they're with the Prime Minister, and they're basically just parroting what he's saying, right? In other words, that was the state of our community at that time. Fast forward 10 years, it's very, very different. That I would confidently claim that does not happen anymore. That cannot happen. If the Prime Minister called the leaders in, he'd get 2 people, right? And the others would not go. They'd do other stuff. It's not that we're all there now, but significant movement in the right direction. And the way it's happened is you start small wherever you can. You make your argument. You make it well. You make it with respect, with dignity, and you keep making it, right? You speak to people individually. You speak to leaders individually. You open with everyone in the community. They're all brothers and sisters. You don't look down on them as sellouts or as people of, they've done this or done that. You engage. And not only do you engage internally, but you go out and show practically what should be done when you're out in the media, when you're out in the public limelight. So your commentary reflects what should be the case, and internally you're having the discussions time and again. And what that done is, and if your argument is strong, rationally, and if it's grounded in Islam, it's only a matter of time before more and more people pick up on it. More young people. It starts with the young, naturally. I don't know for what reason, but it starts with the young. You get more and more people. But these young people are the ones that go into the mosques. They put pressure naturally on the imams. They put pressure on the leaders. And we've seen, and there's much more details to this, but we've seen a significant change over time. Again, I don't want to claim all credit for that from us, but it's been an effort by numerous people in the community who, again, don't agree on all the particulars, but do agree on some very simple points, like it's not an approach when every time something happens somewhere in the Muslim world or somewhere in the West to come and go, we condemn Islam, we condemn this guy, got nothing to do with Islam, we're peace-loving people, blah, 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 which is what was happening, back in 05, before that, after that, for a number of years. Even that doesn't happen now. To be honest, when something happens now around the world, it's hard to find any Muslim spokesperson in Australia who will come out just to condemn.
Well,
right?
Welcome to America.
And it's because the narrative has changed so much, and certain facets have been made so wrong by argument, by conviction, right? And again, not everyone's convinced. A lot of people are convinced. A lot of other people are not convinced, but they can see where the things are moving, and they know that it's very, very difficult for them now to take that sort of position because they're pragmatists, right? We hope that people will be principled, but people who are pragmatists also move because now it's no longer seen to be the right thing to do. And to give you one last example of something very particular, it was very commonplace, again in 05, before that, around, post 9/11, for the government to come out and go, we're really serious about terrorism, Muslims are doing this and that. Here's some counter-violence extremist CVE programs, and here's some money, chuck some money at us and go, go out there and to the leaderships, to the big organizations, anyone really who wants to do it, go out and have youth conferences, go out and have camps, go out and do this and help us solve the problem, right? And basically they're saying to the Muslims, own the problem, go deal with it, right? And from that point in time, us and others have been making the point saying this funding is wrong. Don't take the funding, don't take this money. You're accepting their premises, you're accepting their narrative, you're accepting the point that Islam is a problem. And not only is that not the case, but you're perpetuating the problem, which is Western violence, that causes these reactions, because you are not putting the attention where it should be, which is there, right? And over time, what we saw was, again, there was opposition, there was discussion, there was, blood, sweat and tears, if you will. But over time, we're now at a point, and it's been a while, where if a Muslim organization takes CVE funding, like counterterrorism government funding, they can only do so whilst trying to hide it in some form of fashion, right? They can't do it openly because they will get a reaction from across the community saying, why are you doing this?
Right.
Explain yourself, right? So the point is, go back to the question, start small, start where you can. And, social media allows us these days to do a lot more than we could previously, but just one step at a time, sow the seeds, right? Work on yourself in terms of arming yourself with the relevant Islamic knowledge, with the relevant political knowledge, and one step at a time. No one's asking you to change the world. No one's asking you to be Superman, right? In fact, that's part of the problem. People think they're going to change everything overnight. Slowly, one person, two people. And again, let's not kid ourselves. We're not, even in America, it's not as if there's no one there. There's a lot of people doing good work. And it's just building on that one small step at a time. That's what I would say from the practicality and the uphill battle aspect.
Cool. Well, Jazakallah khair, Uthman. As we wrap up here, how can people learn more about you, find you, your presence online and whatnot, and
get in touch with you? Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
I guess Facebook's probably the most direct means. I have an active Facebook page by my name, Uthman Badar. If you search it on Facebook, you'll come up with both a private and a public page, and I usually use the public page to engage with people. I'm accessible via PM, and send me a PM. I'm on Twitter, tweet me, and other than that, all my work is very much uncopyrighted and available on the internet.
Sure, and we will take up your offer as far as if you could provide us like maybe a reading list of some kind, if you can come up with something, so some of our listeners who they are going to be asking, they want to learn more about to deconstruct concepts like liberalism and etc., postmodernism and whatnot. Those kind of things, those kind of resources would be appreciated.
Yep. Okay.
So
I'll see what I can do. It is something that I've been thinking of writing about more myself on Facebook and through this sort of commentary. But that's going to take some time in between studies and Dawah and a lot of other things. I'll see. I'll try and come up with some sort of.
If you don't mind me asking, what
pointers.
are you studying right now? If you don't mind me asking.
Well, a couple of levels. I study Sharia formally here in Sydney.
MashaAllah.
On the other side, I am currently. I think you got my profile from old.
Yeah, it was some Guardian website or something. I just Googled. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a number of years old.
Yeah.
So I used to study economics. I stopped that about 4 or 5 years ago, and I moved over to philosophy. So I did a master's in continental philosophy, and just a few weeks ago, I've started a PhD.
MashaAllah.
Very cool, very cool. Well, we appreciate. I mean, you're doing a lot of great work for us and setting a great example for us. Not across the pond, but like down under. Is that what they call it, right? Like you know.
The Outback.
The Outback, yeah, you know. Do you have a pet kangaroo by any chance?
No, you can't.
Is that a thing? Like, do y'all keep them around, or koala bears?
No.
No.
Koala bears.
Sorry, these are American questions.
Yeah,
These are American questions. I laughed when you said maybe the people in America aren't familiar with the big scheme of things because we're so unaware of everything that's happening. So
No, I didn't mean that. So I meant because Australia's not important. No one really cares about us down under. I think we're just sort of sitting in the sun and feeding kangaroos or something, wearing crocodile Dundee hats. So, that's not to say that Americans are not politically illiterate, but that's not what I was saying at that particular point.
Maybe he just meant the Mad Mamluks don't know John Howard.
Yeah,
right.
I didn't know John
Well,
Howard
now I know now.
Okay, you didn't know. Okay,
I
didn't know who John Howard. I just thought about the hotel chain. John
the listeners,
Howard.
at least the listeners can empathize with what Sim has to go through every day.
Yes.
With these two knuckleheads. Okay.
All right. Well, Jazakallah khair, Uthman, again for coming through. For our listeners out there, if you have questions or comments, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, like our Facebook page, follow us on Instagram, and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. And we are soliciting donations at www.themadmamluks.com. So send some money. We appreciate everybody who has been donating and like helping us keep this operation running since, as I say over and over again,
we don't make money off this. This is just for operational expenses. It's our belief, long-standing belief, that we work full-time and as well do our duty in Dawah as well, you know. So
sure. All right, so for our special guest Uthman Badar and my co-hosts Sheikh Amr, Saeed, and Sim, this is Mahin signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.